Welcome, everyone. I see everyone is slowly coming into this session. I want to welcome you to our session today. I'm Zach Spicer. I'm the Director of Research and Outreach here with IPAC. And on behalf of IPAC, I'd like to welcome you to our session today, which I think is a very important discussion. This is the first webinar in a series on rebuilding the nation-to-nation relationship in Canada. Subsequent webinars will be happening on April 28th, June 23rd, September 22nd, and November 17th. Today's webinar is part of the programming for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, which is a national alliance of First Nations tribal councils, academic researchers, and public sector practitioners that was created to support First Nations leaders and rights holders that have made the decision to transition out from under the Indian Act to their own inherent rights governance. IPAC is proud to support this work. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge that IPAC's national headquarters is on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and IPAC is grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. We're pleased to have viewers joining us from across the country, and we hope that everyone here will take an opportunity to acknowledge the traditional people of the land in which you live and work on. With that, let me hand things over to Catherine McQuarrie, who is the project manager for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project and our moderator for today.
Thanks very much, Zach. Tansi, Boujou, welcome everyone from, I'm talking to you from unceded Algonquin territory in downtown Ottawa. We're really excited and delighted to have you with us today. It's a bit humbling to see the numbers, and we're really gratified that you took time out of your day to come and learn a little bit about us, and we hope this is the start of lots of engagement with you. As Zach mentioned, this is the start of a series of seminars where we're exploring the major challenges and issues of First Nations self-government in Canada and the nation-to-nation relationship with Canada. The topics for each of this series are providing you some context for how we're approaching the work with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, and how we're working with our community and tribal councils to support them on their path to self-determination. As many of you know, we like to begin gatherings in a good way, coming together with one mind. And to that end, we asked one of our research assistants, MC Miracle, who's a master's student at Carleton University in the public policy program, to open the meeting for us in her language. And MC is from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. Over to you, MC.
Gandoko, Sewada Hosios, Ganigari Westa, Negati, to Chidumunado, Nisanquai Tisa, Niwahi, Sonio Dina Hoda, Niganto Dion Jade. I'm going to go and Skaji and Data Wanuni, Nionconigara, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Ongwe Suha, Etoni de Nionconigora. A going to go and Skaji and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Yatini Saha, Dion Jade, Etino Jok Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Ganigorio, Etoni de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Gunjo Soha, Etoni de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Odero Soha, Etino de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Ohonde Soa. Tino de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Onokosoa, a Tino de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Ojino Soa, a Tino Nionconigora. Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Gayantosora, Dano Jamaica, a Tonio de Nionconigora. A Guego Anskaji, and Data Wanuni, Nionconigora, Dano de Utunorado, Ni Gahiksoha, a Tonio de Nionconigora. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Kundirio, Etonio de Opdot Nyok Kunigora. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Gorantusa Dano Oguira so Atenu de Opdot Nyok Nigara. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Ojido Ogoa, Atenu de Opdot Nyok Kunigora. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Kairi Nigovarate. Atenu de Opdot Nyok Nigora. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Tisoto Radiveres, Etonio Nyok Kunigara. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Chiduwanu Dorado ni Chiduwajia Tonekwa Karakwa, Atenu de Opdot Nyok Kunigara. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigora Dano de Tunorado ni Tisota Asotaneka Karakwa, Atenu de Opdot Nyok Kunigara. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigara Dano de Tunorado ni Yojisto Guaranyo, Etonio Nyok Kunigara. Gwego Anskaji and Data what Ununi Nyok Kunigara Dano de Chiduwanu Rada ni Sinquaya Disa, Atenu de Opdot Nyok Kunigara. Onatoniare wa Gare Terry what Guani Doga Ateno Songini Nikora, Izagi ni Isoada Suroro, Etop New Kunawage. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Amsi. So welcome again, everyone. For thousands of years before the arrival of the first Europeans to this land, the indigenous peoples of the Americas exercised governmental authority over their lands and their peoples. They had successful, thriving societies that were sustainable and economically viable. They treated and traded with each other over vast distances. They lived healthy lives in balance with the land and the resources around them. And this is a fact of our creation stories, of oral histories, and also of increasing historical and archaeological record. So what happened? Why do Indigenous peoples in Canada persistently, on the whole, live in poverty? Why do they continue to have the worst social and economic outcomes of any other Canadian in our society? And more importantly, what will it take to reverse that? And how can it be done? For all of us on this project, the answer lies in a return to self-determination by doing the necessary work to exercise the inherent right of self-government. So today I'm really pleased to introduce you to the two co-founders of the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, Satsan from the Center for First Nations Governance and Dr. Francis Abel of Carleton University. And we also have two representatives from among our community and tribal council partners, the Midori Nicholson from Sawadeno First Nations in British Columbia. I hope I got that right after all my practicing, Midori. And Tribal Council Chief and CEO, Edmund Bellegarde of Foul Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council in Saskatchewan. Midori and Edmund will talk about their community's journey back to self-government and why they're involved in this project. So we're going to start today's session with a round of questions to each of our guests, and then throw open the questioning to you, our online participants. And you can simply ask a question by clicking on the little Q&A box, which is should be on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And you can pose a question at any time during this session, and we'll get to them after our initial discussion. I'd also invite each of you to engage with each other throughout the session through the chat function, which is separate, and it's also at the bottom of the screen. And we're also going to be putting up a couple of polls that we hope that you'll find time to answer so that we can get to know you a little bit better. So today's session, I'd also like to mention, is being recorded and will be available at a later date to watch again. So we'll start with Satsan. Seeing as you're the, so much of this project is founded on your vision for self-government and the work that you've been doing for several decades in communities across the country, we'll start with you. And I guess my question I would begin with is that given that so many First Nations have either settled or are in the middle of negotiating self-government agreements with Canada through the Inherent Right policy, Many others are exercising greater control over their lands, resources. They're doing economic development or essential services like healthcare. What is different about this approach that that you're taking, that we're taking together, and why is it important?
Thanks very much, Catherine. I'd also like to welcome all of the attendees who have taken time out to join us today. I'm coming to you from Shuswap territories, Kamloops, and I'm very, very pleased to be here. Catherine, I think the big difference in terms of what we're doing now is if you look back at the agreements that were negotiated in the past, most of those agreements were negotiated prior to our achieving legal and constitutional recognition of our Aboriginal and treaty rights, including our inherent right to self-government. So the big difference is that what we're working to do now is to implement our inherent right to self-government over our people, our lands, our jurisdiction and laws, our governance systems, resources, both people and resources of our territories. And it's consistent in going back to the fact, as you mentioned, that for thousands of years prior to settlement and colonization and confederation, our people exercised and practiced governmental authorities over their people and their lands for thousands of years. So we're talking about an inherent right, which we always had, given by the Creator, which has survived settlement and colonization and confederation, and is now recognized and affirmed in law and Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. So here we're talking about an inherent right, not a delegated authority under somebody else's jurisdiction, but rather assuming our own authority under our own jurisdiction, coming from our pre-existing sovereignty as First Nations. We know that prior to the settlers arriving in colonization and confederation, that our people were living as full citizens of their own nations with their own language, their own culture, their own traditions, their own spiritual practices, their own history. And we know that we lived on our lands, which sustained us for thousands of years, where we have an obligation and a responsibility to care for it and to treat all the living beings with respect so that they're always there for future generations. We know that we exercised our jurisdiction under our own laws relating to the lands and our peoples and international relations. We had our own systems of government right across this land. We had many, many leaders and experts with different expertise in order to make that happen. We used the resources of our territories and our lands to look after our people, to have an economy. And we know that that changed in our time in Canada. The first settlers arriving on our shores to now, basically we're talking about the origin and content of the Indian Act. And as I'm speaking to you now, the babies being born today are the 8th generation under the Indian Act. In terms of the 5 pillars of the inherent right, as a people under the Indian Act, we are now wards of the Crown with no legal status and capacity as a natural person. In terms of our territories, under the Indian Act, they've made it illegal for us to be out there, to fulfill our roles and responsibilities, to use the land as we always have. In terms of our laws and jurisdiction under the Indian Act, we barely have any policy flexibility. So in effect, we've lost our jurisdiction as a result of it. In terms of governing systems, they outlawed our own governments. They outlawed the potlatch. They outlawed the Sundance. And in terms of resources, they are very, very scarce, limited, and much conflict has arisen as a result of people clamoring for scarce resources. And as far as the resources of our territories, of course, it was made illegal for us to go there. So in other words, the history of our inherent right to self-government in Canada under the Indian Act basically was that it made the practice of our inherent right to self-government illegal. And we have a long, long history of resistance in this country. All of the nations, all of the Indigenous people have been struggling since the time of Confederation for a recognition of our Aboriginal and treaty rights and our inherent right to self-government, to have a new relationship with the Crown. And unfortunately, we were forced into the courts, and where we were able to gain a recognition of our Aboriginal and treaty rights, including our inherent right to self-government. With the inclusion of Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, when it came in, that word existing Aboriginal and treaty rights was interpreted by the Crown to mean that there were no more existing rights. In other words, that Section 35 was an empty box of rights. I mean, we know through our work in the court that Section 35 is now a full box of rights whose content can only be determined by the people who hold it. And that's us as Indigenous people. So the big thing here, and I worked on this case for many, many years, right through to the Supreme Court of Canada on Delgamuukw and Gistaywe, and successive cases together have put us in a position where we can rebuild ourselves as a people. We can rebuild the health and well-being of our people. We can rebuild the identity that's so needed by our young people in terms of who they are as peoples. We can take back our rightful place on our territories to fulfill our obligations and our responsibilities out there. We can put back in place our own laws under our own jurisdiction in order to have this new nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown. We can put back in place our own governance systems without having to negotiate with anybody. That inherent recognition of our inherent right to self-government is there. And when it comes to the resources, the people resource that we need, when we get to our people, we realize that we need all of our people to achieve this. And we also need to start to use the resources on our lands to rebuild our economies, and like the great leaders of the past have said, to look after our people once again, to be responsible. So the big challenge here, given that we've achieved this recognition, is to transition out from under the Indian Act, Section 9124, an oppressive regime that has damaged our people and our communities in a major, major way. And we need to transition back under our inherent right to self-government under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, where we've created that constitutional space. And what it's all about ultimately is the reconciliation between our pre-existent sovereignty as First Nations and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. So this research project has been put together and designed to support First Nations across this country who have made a decision to transition out from under the Indian Act into the realm of their own inherent rights governance, so that we can rebuild the health and well-being of our people, our communities, and our nations, and we can have a true nation-to-nation relationship with Canada as a third order of government, as it should have been at the outset. So the big difference, Catherine, I guess in your question, is that we're talking about pre-existent sovereignty. We're talking about inherent rights that are not the subject of a grant from anybody. We've always had it. And we don't have to negotiate with anybody to rebuild us ourselves. So it's a huge undertaking. We've been under the Indian Act for 8 generations, as I mentioned, and it might take several generations for us to achieve our inherent right to self-government. So I hope that makes sense to your question.
Thanks, Satsan. I can already see some questions popping up that will come around to later that will maybe go in a little more detail on some of these concepts. Just a reminder to folks to please, if you could, not put your questions in the chat box, but go over to the little Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. It'll make it a little bit easier for us to keep track of who's asking what, and give it a better chance that we'll be able to address your question. I'm going to turn now to Dr. Francis Abel at Carleton University, who is the principal investigator of this SSHRC project that we have in partnership with the Center for First Nation Governance and other universities and many communities and tribal councils. Francis, you've been involved in lots of research projects in your career, worked with Indigenous communities, both North and South. I'm wondering how you came to be, or if you could explain how you came to be involved in this particular one, how you see it's different, and what you think we'll see out of it at the end of the day.
Oh, thank you. I'm grateful to be on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation here in Ottawa. Thank you, Satsan, for a really excellent beginning, and thanks to everyone for coming to talk with us today. My role in this webinar is to explain in general terms how our project came to be and how it works. And so I will do that just for a few minutes. Satsan and I met when we were both working in different capacities with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples over 20 years ago. As most of you know, the great achievement of that commission was to offer a vision of a new basis for Indigenous Crown relations based on a more accurate reading of Canadian history. Of course, a vision is just a vision until people can give it life. And as a non-Indigenous person, I recognize the opportunity and the obligation to do my part. Satsan brought these ideas, the idea for this project to me nearly 10 years ago. It grew out of his work with First Nation communities. He saw a need to mobilize research that responded to the needs of the communities who were dismantling the control of the Indian Act and building alternatives. He saw a need to build a network, an alliance of First Nation leaders and activists who are on this journey with academic researchers and the practitioners who could bring the expertise that was needed. The key thing in all of this was to support the work underway in First Nation communities and to invite them to join us. Satsan and I were fortunate to find Catherine McCrory was available. She was first on an executive interchange with IPAC, and since then has continued her work with the project as we went through the long march of getting funding. And we worked with Aaron Alexiak, a doctoral candidate from the University of Waterloo. The magic that happened then when the four of us came together is explained on our website. If you're interested, go have a look. What we were able to do is to garner a relatively modest amounts of SSHRC funding, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funding, to convene 2 think tanks in successive years. We invited First Nation people who we thought would be willing to help us work out the structure of the grant and how it would be governed, how we would begin. And then we went away and submitted an application, which was successful. And so in March 2020, just a year ago, we were awarded a 6-year grant for $2.5 million. I should say right away that that's only part of the resources we have to work with, because each of the partners who joined us brought cash and in-kind contributions, so that we have substantial funding. We have $3.7 million altogether to spend on this 6-year project. I want to say just a little bit about how we were organized. Because the priorities for this project are set in the participating First Nation communities and organizations, it's important for us to have a highly decentralized governance model. So there are 4 research clusters, the Peace and Friendship Treaties in the East, in Ontario, the Robinson and Numbered Treaties, on the Prairies, the Prairie Treaties, and in British Columbia, the Aboriginal Title Lands. Each of those clusters is led by co-leads, one an eminent Indigenous academic, another a highly distinguished practitioner, and they work with communities in each of those geographical areas. There's much more I could say about our internal decision-making, but that will give you an idea of the structure. And I just want to say here that it's been my honor to be involved with a wonderful group of people. We come together, the co-leads and the people you see before you, and a couple others come together in a steering committee. And we've had a wonderful time in the first year figuring out how to adapt to COVID and what we can do. Our partners include 6 First Nations, 2 tribal councils, 5 universities, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, and Dark Matter Labs, an international organization that specializes in knowledge mobilization. We also have a partnership with Steve Cornell and Miriam Jorgensen and his colleagues at the Native Nations Institute in Arizona. We'll be glad to tell you more about what we've done in the first year in the questions and answers. But I wanted to conclude by telling you our principles, so you know what we stand for and what we're trying to achieve, and then offer a few hints about how you could continue to be involved with us. First, our first principle is that all of the work that we do is community-led, and all of it responds to the priorities of communities. That means a great deal of communication is very, very important, and we work hard at communicating among ourselves and with all the First Nations involved. Second, we follow ethical principles set out in OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession, and Tri-Council ethical principles. And within those constraints, all of the work that we do is public. And it's very important to us that we communicate as we go along how we're doing, successes and failures. 3, an important activity for all of us is knowledge dissemination or knowledge mobilization. A big part of what we do is supporting peer-to-peer learning, contact among First Nation and Indigenous organizations who are working on the same thing. And we work hard to capture that knowledge so that others may make use of it. 4, we have a major commitment to working with youth. We hope that we can make a contribution to training the next generation of Indigenous academics and Indigenous leaders. And so we have an ambitious recruitment program. We have arrangements for mentorship and training. At the moment, we have 9 research assistants from across the country. And when COVID permits, and we're able to work in communities again, we anticipate having more research assistants who are students, and also community members who will be researchers as part of the project. The 5th and final principle is that we're all committed to building for the future. This is we have 6 years of funding, but that's not, we hope, the end of the work that will go on. And after the project is over, we expect to leave behind a full record of the community achievements, the work that we've done, the research we've been able to do, and a durable network of people who can be involved after the project has concluded to continue the work of getting out from under the Indian Act and building alternatives. Now, for information on how to be involved, the best place to do is look at our website. But let me say that, first of all, you could follow our work by giving us your email address, and we will, we're active social media users, and we will definitely be talking to everybody about what we're doing. If you want more information, please write to us. We hope you'll use our work, whether or not we know about it, but that if you find something that's useful or you need something we might have, please ask. We hope you may choose to collaborate with us. So if your nation or organization is interested, we're interested in talking to you. And finally, you may choose to join up. And over the years, we will be adding more people to the partnership so that we continue the work. There's an open invitation, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Frances. I'm going to turn now to 2 of our community and tribal council partners, starting with Midori Nicholson, who is from an isolated First Nation in British Columbia. It looks so beautiful there near King Cum Inlet. I'd love to go. Midori, your community, I know, has a long history of resistance and wanting to maintain your traditions and your traditional governments. But you're just, in terms of our project, starting down the path of returning to self-government. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your community's journey, what you're learning so far, and what you hope to get out of the project.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here to share a bit of our experience. We are on the central coast of British Columbia, and we're in the mainland inlets. In the tip of Vancouver Island, you go in several hours to our remote communities. And where there are pros and cons to where our nations are. We are in beautiful places where our Creator placed us, but it also means that as there's not a lot of non-Indigenous people in our territories, which is a pro in our experience, the con is that often our people have to leave our communities. And we've been pressured for the past 100 years or more to leave our territories, to leave our communities. And our communities, our ancestors, our grandparents, they really pushed back. And their resilience, they laid a path forward for us so that we could stay, even though that's become more difficult to do. So we live in a tiny portion of our traditional territories in our watershed in a small little area, considering that the rest of the watershed and the rest of our marine territories, there's no roads in or out to our territories, is kind of under this assumed sovereignty of the Crown. And they came and took our trees, they took our fish, and did everything they could to remove us and our children, and made our governance system, which is our, the Chinook word, the potlatch, it's, for us as Kwakwaka'wakw and for Musqueam, this was our house of our governance, and so many pieces of who we are. And so when that was, made illegal, and it was illegal to hire lawyers to fight for these things, for our rights, our parents and grandparents still continue to do that. And we're able to do that, I think, in great part from our isolation. So that has been a pro. Obviously, sometimes isolation is seen as a negative, but in our case, we have remained within our territories against all odds. And so the hardest part, I think, when we were looking, and we look at the destabilization of our governance, the chipping away of it, and then the Indian Act system that was put in place for us to function under. Increasingly, we've been seeing how difficult this has been for us. And so instead of trying to indigenize an Indian Act system or trying to fix and make work in the community something that we are forced to kind of work under, we really wanted to look back and forward, but also look at our traditional governance system and rescaffold that house and rebuild that house and put our energy back into rebuilding that house. And that is a complex and it's not an easy process. It also can be incredibly overwhelming. So we reached out to the Center for Indigenous Governance to say, what else is happening? Who else is doing this? How can we do this without recreating a wheel? If you're small and you don't have a lot of resources, how do we best talk to other people on how they've done this? And so we're not fitting a square peg in a round hole and continuing to be held under a system that doesn't serve us as people. And so we had this, we developed a good relationship and learned a lot, and we brought in, Satsang came in 2 years ago with a team to work us through as a community for 8 days to look at these things. And it was really empowering for us to do this work. This was not easy work to do to take 8 days out when people from their time to focus and work through very, very painful subjects. But there was a lot of power in that collective kind of process, and it was communal, and this is who we are as people, as we're communal people. So to bring us back together to really talk about what is this going to look like going forward. There's so many things that have happened, so much groundwork and paths have been laid for us, but it is very difficult to do when we're still spinning our wheels often in frustration with where we're at. So that piece was really empowering for us, and to get a lot of our membership who doesn't live at home anymore to return home to come be part of this process and build that vision forward was really important. So when we look at an inherent rights strategy for us, we sit at no table, right? This is not about government or anyone else trying to figure this out for us for an agreement. This is absolutely just our process, so that we have this common understanding for our own nations. And so we've identified some of these. We were able to weed through these pieces to create some footpath forward for us, I guess, in terms of steps. A lot of it was knowledge-based, or for our membership, having to re-engage on things that were taken, knowledge of the land, knowledge of all of these pieces of culture, looking at the roles of men and women in governance. How do we message? How do we reach our membership now in 2021 when we don't, before we lived in the same village, now we're spread out. How do we engage in that way? So how do we communicate, or as we call it, Tanenwakola? And so we kind of put these pieces down, and we're able to weed through it without feeling so overwhelmed by the job that's at hand. So that part has been really good for us. And I think the challenges for some of it, though, is that we have to be patient, because this takes time. And there's often a pressure that we need to come up with something quickly. And yet this healing piece for us takes time, but also it requires capacity, which is another challenge. And while we still have to keep the Indian Act governance functional in the community while we do all this extra work, it means an extra workload for everybody. But it requires patience with each other in our healing process as well, but also building something that's real and significant and will be long lasting for our future generations deserves that. And so when this piece on restoring our own governance, I find that sometimes there are lots of opportunities for people to say that this is something that can be done and can be done quickly. It actually takes a lot of time and investment. So in our experience, I think that that's worthwhile to recognize, to put back our laws and values and our cultural practices back in place. So that's been our experience. Even though we are a small remote community, we know who we are and we know where we come from. And we to give us an opportunity to come together and recognize what has happened to us and how we might make a better future for it has been very powerful, and that we're not alone, that other nations are doing that, so that we can have a true nation-to-nation relationship and not be a band under Canada. So that has been, that's an important piece of our process.
Wow,
So
thank you very much. That's a very rich context for the work that you're doing, and it sounds like very powerful work for your community as well. I'm going to turn now to Edmund Bellegarde, Tribal Chief and CEO of File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council, which represents 11 communities in Saskatchewan and Treaty 4, and already has made many significant advances in governance, and is successfully delivering high quality and a wide range of programs and services throughout their territory. So, I mean, given the advances that you have made and the work you've already done, Edmund, what attracted you and your members to taking part in this project? And how do you see it benefiting the Tribal Council and the communities that you represent?
Thanks, Catherine, and good day to everybody that is joining us. I just want to start by acknowledging the prayer that was shared by Amzi, and acknowledge our panelists here, Satsan and Francis and Midori, for sharing. And thank you for the question, Catherine. I join you from my home today in Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Our tribal council, File Hills Qu'Appelle, has 11 First Nations of the Neheo, Anishinaabe, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota nations. And collectively, we have more than 17,000 citizens. I've been leading the organization since 2006, so I'm just going to quickly share a bit of our journey and then talk about the practical realities of being involved with the project. So since that starts in 2006 in the role, we've had to try and figure out what our role as a tribal council was in the realization of our nation's inherent right to self-government, and how we strengthen delivery of essential services to our citizens. We began our governance review process back in 2008, and some of the common statements that I would frequently hear in meetings or from our leaders or people, they would often say that we have our traditional ways, we have our natural laws, enough with this Indian Act and enough with these white policies. We need to get back to who we are and our traditional ways. Another common theme that I would often hear is we need help with our bread and butter issues that are facing chief and councils. We need help getting INAT to lift the funding caps on band support programming, lift the funding cap on post-secondary education. We need a new water treatment facility. We need more housing and renovation funding. So that was a common theme. And so that was really some of the symptoms of the governance challenge and the systemic challenge that we were under a regime and that we were facing. So back in the early days of that governance review process, we began working with the Navajo Nation citizen by the name of Dr. Manly Begay Jr., who at the time was with the Native Nations Institutes, University of Arizona, Tucson. And he was a co-director on the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development that began in the late 80s. And some of the pillars that we took from that nation building research and nation building process were practical jurisdiction, capable institutions, cultural match, long-term strategic orientation, and leadership. Fast forward a few years and going through that governance process, strengthening our internal capacities, looking at our institutional context, reconnecting, reawakening the languages and laws and through ceremony, reconnecting with that part of our traditional governance system, we were introduced to SATSAN and the Rebuilding First Nations Governance Project, and the Center of First Nations Governance. SATSAN's covered off the 5 pillars: the people, the land, laws and jurisdiction, governing systems, and resources. At the time, we were also doing a lot of work with other post-secondary institutions on our local public policy school. And what they were showing us or telling us was a good Indigenous governance programming was really about Indigenous compliance. It wasn't about inherent right to self-government. It was more about Indigenous compliance, how we comply with the Indian Act, how we have to manage our affairs to meet the provincial Saskatchewan Health Act, the Saskatchewan Education Act, some of the infrastructure programming. So we really didn't feel connected. So when we got the chance to join the research project, we began with a number of readings and information and meetings and teleconferences with people like Satsan, Francis, and Catherine. But in July of 2019, the Transitioning Indian Act Governance Building Community Workshop that was staged at Carleton University in Ottawa, that was key. So we had our governance team go to Ottawa, to Carleton 2 summers ago. But before that, we had been educating ourselves about the work of the project to date, or to that point in time, and just a webinar that Satsan and Catherine had with the executive director from Lilwat Nation at the time was Ernest Armand, and some of that practical experience that Lilwat Nation had achieved and was going through. We reached out to Ernest and we had an introductory supper with Lilwat Nation's chief, and there were 2 council members there and the executive director of operations, Ernest. And that's how we started. So following the Carleton workshop, we were invited out to Lilwat Nation. We began developing this relationship with the Lilwat people. And we went out to Lilwat in September 2019 to observe and participate in their governance process and a citizen engagement session. And again, Satsan was facilitating and leading, but this was really about engaging the people and the citizens of Lilwat Nation. What we learned on the ground in Lilwat, it was their law and policy review and kind of where they started from with their nation, their practical experience going through that, not only from an administrative and operational, but how they were to rebalance some of their rights and traditions and natural laws, what their successes were to date, what their challenges that they were facing or hurdles that they had to get around or get through or get over. We brought our governance team, so we were learning from their process in real time and how to adapt it specifically to our territory and our 11 First Nations, our land and our sacred places. So our Tribal Council governance team is now working alongside our nations as we move towards the implementation of our File Hills Qu'Appelle Council of Nations. So this new Council of Nations expands our circle from 11 chiefs in the Indian Act structure and the Tribal Council structure. It expands it from 11 chiefs to include chiefs, all the councillors, our head persons, our Council of Life Speakers, our medicine people, our language and culture knowledge keepers, our Women's Council, and our Youth Council. We're going to gather 4 times a year, and this expanded and more inclusive Council of Nations will then set the agenda, take our positions, have a much more enriching discussion about the impacts or the way forward and the challenges and issues facing our nations, and come together with collective positions to guide the operational aspects. So on a practical sense, that's what we're moving forward with, is how do we support our nations in their achieving that's inherent right to self-government. So we're a really grateful partner in the project of rebuilding First Nations governance. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Edmund. I take it from your comments that for all your successes, you felt you were busy, but realized you weren't actually self-governing. So,
yes,
and that's the journey that you're on now. Thank you very much. So time to turn it over to you, our participants, and the questions that have been starting to build so far. The first one I'm going to start with is, I think, quite a common one, and it certainly has been a question in my mind over the years. And Satsan probably is the best one to answer this, but Midori, given her small community, might want to as well. And so basically the question is that, you know, there's no issues around the principle of self-government, but practically, how is it going to work in the case of small communities of 500 people or less? And you know, that is commonly population size on many of the reserves in Canada. And then secondarily, how would that actually link up with kind of local, provincial, federal government? Satsan, do you want to take first stab at that?
Yes, thanks very much. That's probably the most common question, issue, challenge we meet on this path, and it goes back to the point of the Indian Act fracturing us apart as nations and separating us from the rest of Canada and from the rest of the Constitution onto Indian reserves with a band membership under the Indian Act. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, we're 8 generations under the Indian Act, and people are kind of stuck in this rut of seeing themselves like that. And what we're learning through this project is we have some small nations coming in with a limited small group of people, but who are also saying and realizing that they are a part of a bigger nation that was fractured and cut apart as a result of the Indian Act. So what happens then is the realization of people that we need to rebuild ourselves as a nation. And so that's the other side of this. This is what comes from it. But I think regardless of the size, the number of the people, that we can still do this. We have to do it, because when our people learn about the Indian Act, the brutality of it, the policy objectives associated with it, they say we can't sentence another generation of our people to this. And so this issue of small people is, to me, small numbers is not an issue. Rights are rights are rights. And in terms of linking in with Canada and British Columbia, the Supreme Court has put in place legal and constitutional procedures to drive negotiations toward reconciliation. So it doesn't matter the numbers. You can position yourself under Section 35, under your own inherent rights jurisdiction, and have this new government to government relationship.
Thank you. Midori, do you want to wade in? You talked yourself in your presentation about, you know, how the work can seem overwhelming, especially when you're small, and in addition, you are isolated from a lot of support and services. So what's your take on the question?
Well, I would absolutely agree with what Satsan has said, but it is a practical recognition about our size in terms of capacity. But I think that it's still the most important work that we have to do. I mean, there's over 200 nations in British Columbia. And we all have different sizes. And in some regards, you know, I would say size doesn't matter then. We still need to be respected as the nation that we are within our territories. And if we have access back to our own resources that were taken from us, then you know, I think it's not for anyone else to determine. We're not asking government to figure this out for us or figure out how we will fit into their structure. This is for us to determine.
Thank you. I wouldn't mind hearing from Edmund on this too, particularly given that you are representing a tribal council, which is, I know, not a representative organization, but does, you know, is a way for your communities to act collectively together in some areas. So do you have a viewpoint on this?
I think we're facing that challenge of what the essential services are, but the framework or the authority structures and the accountability issues are not to our people, essentially. So that's probably the challenge as we move forward, is how do we engage, how do we reawaken some of these old ways, because they're expressed in our languages and oftentimes through ceremony in our spiritual leaders. There's a different way of being that our nations are getting back to, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is how we transition out of Indian Act processes and these funding alignments and all of these areas. So we're trying to separate that out and return to the more traditional, but then it's also the practical reality that we live in this world. We're surrounded by these non-First Nations practices and processes, and we've got that important work of building the bridges. Or what we're turning our attention to now is, how do we strengthen public policies in Canada? How do we strengthen public policies in the provincial government, where those policies have a deep impact on our people and citizens? So how do we bring value to that table, and then how do we strengthen those policy formats? Our traditional leaders and our treaty scholars remind us all the time that coexistence, reciprocity, that recognition of our status as peoples means that we have to work hard at having and possessing these good relations with our neighbors. And we have to sometimes adapt what they're sharing with us to meet our needs, and we have to share ideas with them so that they can adapt to strengthen their process.
Thank you very much, Edmund. As I mentioned at the outset, the number of nations in Canada, not a huge number, but several have already reached self-government agreements. And so one of our questions from participants is, in fact, about one of those existing new self-government agreements, and that is the Nishka Treaty. Wondering if participants or panelists think it's a good treaty and want to be emulated as a framework. And if not, why not? Is there anyone in particular? Satsan, go ahead.
I'll take a stab of that. In my former life, I was the regional chief for British Columbia to the Assembly of First Nations, and also served on the executive of the First Nations Summit here. During the time that the Nishka Nation were negotiating their treaty, and there was always this discussion around it, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. And my approach to that was in the context of recognition and respect. If this was what the Nishka Nation was pursuing, and this is what they thought was good for them, that's their business. You know, and I think one of the principles of our research project and our nation rebuilding project is to bring those same principles forward to the nations and the people that we work with. We have to recognize and respect their vision and their priorities, and it's ultimately their right that they are dealing with. So that's my take on that.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists want to speak to that one, Edmund?
Yeah, and I wouldn't share an opinion on whether it's good or bad for the Nishka Nation. I would respect the Nishka Nation's people. That's the process that they have set out for the interests of their people and to advance the interests of their nation. And I think what I would say is it's much more of a modern framework that's negotiated with all of these contemporary issues, whether it's federal or provincial governments and the interaction between those governing bodies. I think it has developed some excellent principles to utilize as a framework in advancing Indigenous rights or inherent right to self-government principles moving forward. And I think we'll learn from that. But again, it goes back to, this cannot be a pan-Canadian approach. It has to be, our nations and our territories and our sacred places and our people's connection to the land. That's that way, our way of being and our way of knowing and our sacred connection. So we have to understand that anything that's developed as maybe a template or a process has to then be adapted to the territories and the people and the traditions and the languages and the cultures there, and it has to be made their own by them. And I think that was some of the things that I certainly echo from Midori's comments in their experience on the West Coast.
Thank you. I think we can squeeze one more in quickly. We'll go maybe a couple of minutes long, and I understand many of you will have other commitments at the top of the hour. So we'll say thanks in advance for taking part. Keep following the project, and you can, a number of people have asked about whether they can watch this later. It is being recorded. It will be up on our website shortly. I can't promise the exact time frame. I want to end on this question because it is related. And you probably will all have a comment on this. It says, one particular question I'd like to see discussed today or in the future, and I think we will come back to it, is how can we dismantle the Indian Act when it is the Indian Act chiefs and councils that are often the ones that approve the way forward? It almost seems contradictory to me. Now, Satson, I know you touched a little bit on this in terms of the importance of engaging the people, but this is a little bit sort of sharper question on that one. Go for it.
It's a key question to this whole project, because I've been working on this since we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada, December 11th, 1997, on Delgamuukw and Gisteway, with the first legal and constitutional recognition of our title and rights. And been doing this for a long, long time. And finally, I started to see young leaders, courageous leaders under the Indian Act realizing that this is not a good place for us to be. This was not designed for our health and well-being. It's killing our people. And young leaders making the decision that we need to get out of this, and we need to go back to our inherent right to self-government. And at the same time realizing that our inherent right to self-government is collectively and communally held by our people. Our people are the rights holders. So what's really unique about this project is that leaders have made that decision and are saying to their people, we recognize you as the rights holders. However, we have to deal with the status quo. And as nation members, we will support this. So that's what's happening. The decision has to be made. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And I'm always really thankful for that courageous leadership and vision of people seeing that we need to do this, because it takes vision, it takes leadership, it takes discipline, it takes commitment, and a tremendous generosity of spirit as far as our people are concerned. So that's really important.
Thank you. Offer a chance to any of our panelists who want a last word on this one. Edmund?
Yeah, I think this is one of the common challenges that we face in the Indian Act and the sort of the colonial process, and where that authority rests, and all of those structures and processes that are not ours, all those accountability structures and mechanisms that are not ours. So how do we do that? And there's always been a gap. The Indian Act has been very divisive amongst our people. It's created a lot of fractures of our nations, and it's been very successful in its aims of achieving assimilation or achieving dominance and subservience of First Nations people underneath its legislative powers, and how those are applied or how they're enforced. So I think we really have the challenge of giving voice to all of our citizens, whether that voice is supportive, whether it's not supportive. They need to have voice, and that's probably one of the biggest principles that we're trying to bring forward, is making our big lodge circles bigger, making them more inclusive, making sure everybody has a chance to share their opinion, to give voice to what they feel, and then how do we bring that to a collective common purpose, and how do we get better, more effective at delivering essential services and making sure that the capacity is there and the resources are in place. So it is those good governance. It is building that institutional capacity. We see our tribal council as supports or helpers to our member nations in providing these supports or facilitating these processes, or doing some of that heavy lifting work, so that they can get full recognition. The rights, the collective rights, are held collectively with all of our nation's citizens, not by a chief and council. And I think that's some of that hard discussion that we're facing with, and decolonizing or getting out from under the Indian Act. It is difficult work. We're having difficult discussions amongst our own people, in different levels of our communities, because those things, it's very hard to change. So it does take leadership and commitment, but it also, you have to have your foundations of your governance house strongly underneath you, and rebuilding that strength is where our focus is.
Thank you very much, Edmund. And with that, I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up for today. One of the joys of working on this project for me is that I always get to learn so much from all my colleagues, and I thank them and the ones here today for sharing their knowledge and their wisdom and their experience. And thank all of the participants for your engagement. I see you've been busy talking with each other, but also posing us some great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to, by any stretch, all of them, but they are important to us. We will read them. It will give us some ideas for other things that we can work on, other information we can get out there. So they're all useful. They're all helpful. Thank you very much. I can't help smiling to myself that one of our polling questions was, how did you hear about this? And the greatest extent was word of mouth. So one thing that's still working with our traditions across this country is the moccasin telegraph, obviously. So glad to hear it. As I said, this will be posted later. So if you want to watch again or share it with others, maybe some good class material for some of you who are instructors. And with that, I would like to thank again all of you for being here, and thank our partners at IPAC for making this possible. And once again, you can read about us, follow our work by either visiting the Rebuilding First Nations Governance website, or also the Center for First Nations Governance website. They've got lots of reading material and tools and kits there for people to reflect on. And you can follow our progress on Twitter at @FirstNation_governance. Thank you all very, very much. And I wish you well for the balance of the week. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.